Thank you very much. Another in our series of webinars, and we are going to discuss very important issue that I guess the whole world is watching because I think it's going to be the first showdown of the Biden administration, and it's going to be this revival or whatever else happens with the nuclear deal with Iran. And we have two great speakers from Iran. We have Mr. Kayhan Barzegar, who we are lucky to have as our regular speaker. I think it's already second or third of the our webinars where Mr. Barzegar will be speaking, and he is director of the Institute for the Middle East Strategic Studies in Tehran. And we also have Dr. Ross Harrison, who is a professor and teaches classes in our own foreign policy and strategy course at GFSIS, but he is also the director, excuse me, he's also director of research at Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, let me give floor to the speakers. They will talk for about 5 minutes, and then we will all have the opportunity to ask questions or express our opinions. So let me ask Professor Barzegar to start.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you some of my views as an Iranian academic. I think Iran and the US relations is very complicated. It became further complicated with the Trump presidency, with his withdrawal from the nuclear deal, and it continues until today. I think the legacy that President Trump wrote about for this deal has further complicated the Iran-US relations. But I can tell you that the Iran-US relations in the Biden time cannot be deducted to the nuclear deal. There are broader issues between the two countries, I believe. The question is that how Biden administration would like to present and express its Middle East policy, especially towards Iran. And the conventional wisdom is that he would be busy with the coronavirus, how to deal with that, with the de-Trumpization of the White House, and returning the US to the international norms and obligations that Trump administration has somehow destroyed. That leads me to think that the Biden administration might be somehow less active in the region. If this is the case, then we would see, new developments between, the two countries' relations. I still think that, of course, the Biden coming to power was a psychological relief for the Iranian, no doubt. But at the same time, that is not going to lead to think that with the Biden in the White House, the situation would get better, in my belief. I think that the relations is still fragile. At the top of the relations, it comes the nuclear deal and how to renegotiate with that. But going in that regard, I still think that the regional issues and Iran's missiles program are also the focus of the possible talk, at least on the US side. But I believe that right now, there are a few reasons, perhaps 5 reasons, to think that the two sides' relations will not get to, anywhere in the near future. First of all, is that the Biden administration is at the beginning of its office. He wants to be, to show that the administration is strengthening, given the fact that the U.S., elections has somehow divided the United States in two parts. Therefore, he needs to show some strength. In the other side, we have the Iranian who believe that, they will not retreat. They have resisted so far, and they are not going to retreat at this point. This is one reason that make me to think that, in the near future, there won't be any talk between the two sides. The second reason, in my understanding, is that the two sides distrust, especially strategic distrust, has been much more, increased by the violation of, the JCPOA. On the U.S. side, Trump withdrew from the deal, the nuclear deal. There is no doubt it was a wrong decision. On the Iranian side, Iran took 5 steps, reducing its nuclear commitment, and at the same time started to enrich uranium to the 20%. And the Iranian parliament passed uh, a, a law that gives a deadline to the Iranian government to stop any activity until 21st of February, which is, about 10, 15 days. And it relates to Iran's domestic politics. We have the presidential elections as well. So it's too late for Iran to return in this regard. Therefore, the second reason is this current distrust between the two sides. The two sides think that they are leveraging any talk at this point. The third point is that, this strategic distrust between the two countries in the regional affairs. I believe that this kind of distrust started after 2003 when the U.S. attacked, Iraq and started the war. That was the beginning of Iran's increased power in the region, and the U.S. started to return this state of affairs, but so far unsuccessful. Then the situation further become complicated with the assassination of Iranian national Commander Soleimani. This distrust has been further, increased. And right now, I think both at the level of the state and the nation, there is a great distrust about the U.S. actions. That will also impact any possible talk between Iran and the U.S. Third, it comes to the issue of uh, it comes to the issue of, possible talks when Washington thinks that it has the leverage of sanctions that was brought about by Trump's administration. Perhaps Biden administration think that at this level it's a great leverage. Why should, Biden tries to lift those sanctions, as he said a few days ago, or perhaps 1, 2 days ago, that Iran must stop first its enrichment program and return to its commitment, then the US will start the talk. On the Iranian side, the Iranians are saying that no, the US violated the nuclear deal and it must start from the US. So we have this question of who should start. And this is bringing a kind of distrust between the two sides. This is something that the two sides are, at the current state of affairs. And the last thing that I would like to say is the issue of deterrence and miscalculation of both sides. Both sides are thinking that they have the upper hands in the negotiations. Iran thinks that it has its own independent enrichment program, which brings a kind of deterrent, capability for Iran, even the independent enrichment. And at the same time, it has its missiles program that gives Iran an upper hand and buy times for Iran. And at the other side, the US has the leverage of sanctions and thinking that time is, against Tehran. because Tehran needs, to lift its sanctions. What I need to say is that for Iran, the nuclear deal was lifting the economic sanctions. Of course, solving security and strategic discrepancies and a standoff with the US was the case, but the priority was lifting the sanctions. But on the US side, it was a security deal, trying to bring Iran on the regional issues and the so-called changing Iran's regional behavior or limiting Iran's missiles program. So we see a kind of, confrontation of, interests between the two sides, how they go ahead. My point is that, and this is my last point, is that the nuclear issue and the possible talk with the Biden administration or the next Iranian administration is only one matter, and we should not deduct this to the nuclear issue. There are other issues which are of great significance for Iran. Iran cannot afford to retreat from the region. It will follow its regional active policy because there is a logic behind Iran's strategic thinking to preempt the threats from the region, because the issue is the survival of the state for Iran in the broader Middle East zone. And at the same time, the missiles program of Iran is the element of Iran's deterrent power because Iran feels threatened. And Trump administration made the wrong decision because he and his team thought that by weakening Iran or collapsing Iran from inside, he could force Iran to negotiate or talk. But I believe that strengthening Iran will better talk because it feels more secure. If Biden tries to seek this, approach of Trump in the future negotiations, I think any talk will be doomed. And I have no hope, which is unfortunate, of course, and that will further complicate Iran-US relations in the near future. So I stop here.
Quite pessimistic. Ross.
Yes, thank you, Shota. And it's an honor to be here under the auspices of GFSIS, the Rondeli Foundation. And it's an honor to be here with my colleague, Kayhan. Kayhan and I have interacted a number of different forums, different places across the globe and in the Middle East. So it's an honor to be back here with you, Kayhan. And with GFSIS, as you mentioned, Shota, I've been teaching at GFSIS for going on 10 years. And it's one of the highlights of my year to come to Tbilisi. So it breaks my heart that last year we had to do it online. And it looks like this year we're going to do it online too. But for Eka, it's great to be back here with Eka and her very, very capable team. So thank you very much for hosting this. I think I have a slightly more optimistic view perhaps than Kayhan does, but not by much. I think as Kayhan mentioned, there's a plethora, an abundance of issues between the United States and Iran. The nuclear deal may be the most immediate, but it's certainly not the only issue. And those issues, many of those issues accumulated during the 4 years of the Trump administration and have been an inheritance of the Biden administration. The nuclear deal, I think, is certainly the most immediate and also in some ways, as Kayhan mentioned, the most difficult because of the political dynamics in Washington and also, to be fair, the political dynamics in Tehran. So what I'd like to do is talk about what I think might be possible and what I think is probably much less probable to expect in the ensuing months in terms of US-Iranian relations. I do think that there is a likelihood that the US can return to the JCPOA and that Iran, I understand the issues around the parliament and the Majlis, but that Iran can return to the limits on enrichment imposed by the JCPOA. I said that there's a likelihood that this will happen before the elections in Iran in June. And the reason for that is I think there are obstacles on both sides. And Kayhan very articulately outlined them. One is the issue of sequencing. The Biden administration essentially is saying that Iran needs to return to the limits imposed by the deal before sanctions are relieved and before the US rejoins the JCPOA. And Iran, from its own perspective, understandably, says that the Biden administration, the Biden administration needs to return to the deal first because it was the US that basically breached the deal by withdrawing from a multilateral deal in 2018, and that needs to be the first act before Iran returns to the limits imposed. I think if I listen to, from the Iranian side, if I listen to Foreign Minister Javad Zarif in his comments, I think there is a way to square the circle and get beyond the sort of cat and mouse game between the Biden administration and Tehran. And I think Foreign Minister Zarif paved a path for that by basically saying that the Europeans can play a very, very strong role there, and that there's ways to both coordinate and sequence. So I think there's probably, if the politics don't interfere, I think there's a way between now and June, when the elections take place in Iran, there are ways to probably get around that so that the U.S. can return to the JCPOA and Iran can return to the limits. I do think the diplomatic piece here is very, very important. I think it will require a pretty heavy lift on the part of Secretary of State Blinken and his deputy, Wendy Sherman, both of whom were involved in the earlier negotiations with former Secretary of State Kerry during the Obama administration. And I'm sure that the best diplomatic efforts will be made on the part of the Iranians. So I think it'll take some effort on the part of the Europeans, possibly even the Omanis again. But I'm somewhat optimistic that between now and June, both parties can return to the deal. Here's what I don't think is going to happen. I'm almost certain is not going to happen. And that is that there's some in the United States that are arguing that the US should try to renegotiate the deal, use the leverage of sanctions to negotiate a new deal. That's not going to happen. Certainly not going to happen from Iran's perspective, particularly because the United States was the party that walked out of the deal. And I don't think linking the nuclear deal to other regional issues, it's going to be a non-starter. So I think between now and June, I don't see any kind of a renegotiation of the nuclear deal. I do think beyond the June elections, the question about can the Iran nuclear deal be updated to deal with some of the impending sunset clauses that I believe some of which are going to expire in 2024 or 2025. I think with the best diplomatic efforts, perhaps after June, there's a possibility of the US and Iran negotiating perhaps amendments to the deal or some kind of new modalities to the deal, or perhaps even a new deal. That's a possibility. It's certainly not going to happen between now and June. And I don't think that we should even think about going to that step first. The first step is to get the US back into the deal and for Iran to return to the limits. Here's what I think is not going to happen in terms of US-Iranian relations. And that is that the US is not going to be able to negotiate with Iran on its missile program. It's not going to be able to negotiate with Iran on its regional activities for the reasons that Kayhan mentioned. And that is that Iran's missile program is a core element of its deterrent strategy, and it sees the United States and the US allies in the region, namely Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel. It sees them as the major existential threat to Iran, and so negotiating away Iran's capability with its primary nemesis, the United States, it's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. So I think, are there ways to negotiate Iran's missile program? Possibly in some kind of a multilateral setting where threat perceptions over time are reduced. Iran's not going to give up its missile program, but could it scale back its missile program in some way that's palatable both to the United States and to our allies in the region? Possibly, but it's not going to happen on some kind of a bilateral negotiation because of the structural issues that I mentioned. On the regional activity level, I think what's important to understand is that Iran's activities in the Middle East, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, are part of a bigger conflict system. It's not just Iran's activities in the region. The countries I mentioned are either extremely fragile states or they're states that have been in civil war. And they have drawn in all of the regional actors. Iran's activities are certainly the most profound in terms of their capability, but they've drawn into northern Syria and into Iraq, they've drawn in Turkey. They've drawn in Saudi Arabia into Yemen. They've drawn in Israel into Syria. And if you go even beyond the Levant, the main part of the Middle East, you go to Libya, where Iran is not involved at all. You've got Turkey involved, the UAE involved, Egypt involved. So we have a regional conflict system that is driving a proxy war between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel. And so focusing on Iran's activities in the region are fine. It's certainly what the US wants to do. But I think what the way to address Iran's regional penetration of the region or Iran's forward defense program is, number one, reduce the overall threat perception perceived from Tehran by the United States, but also to address the broader conflicts, the civil wars in Syria and this fragility in Iraq and so forth, and in some kind of a multilateral regional framework. And I think Iran has been open to a regional framework. I think the HOPE initiative that was proposed by Foreign Minister Zarif. So I see opportunity to discuss regional issues, but much more on a regional and international framework. I don't see any kind of conversations between the US and Iran on the missile issue or on the regional activity issue to go very far anytime during the Biden administration. I'll stop there so we can take questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ross. So let's say stage one is that both sides re-enter the nuclear deal, and this might happen until June, hopefully. And since these parties have already signed this deal, and interestingly, when you read the statements coming from Washington D.C. and Iran, both sides underline the urgency of the issue. The Iranians are saying it should be done soon because then the elections are coming up. And the Americans are saying it should be done soon because Iran will quite soon have enough enriched uranium for the bomb. It might be there in a month or in a few months, but the deal must be done quickly. So that makes us optimistic that sides really want to explore the possibility of re-entering or restarting the deal. There will be the political ground standing, but in their hearts, both sides want to have the deal. Am I right to assume that?
Are you directing it to me?
Yeah, to both of you.
I mean, I think ideally, if you're asking, do I think both sides have an interest in returning to the status quo ante, back to 2015? I think the answer is yes, but I think, as Kayhan mentioned, gave us a cautionary note in terms of what is possible given the political dynamics in Washington. And there are those that are saying that the Trump administration was wrong to leave the deal in 2018, but that there's a certain amount of leverage that's been created by the sanctions and that leverage should not be given up. There's that dynamic and how the Biden administration can navigate that and create a diplomatic pathway that would allow the Iranians also to express their grievances at the fact that the US, remember, the Iranians never left the deal. They left the limits imposed by the deal under the conditions of the deal, but they've never walked away from the deal. They're still in the deal. So from their perspective, the political question there is how can they, given their political sensitivities, how can they work with the Biden administration that still has in its pocket the Trump administration sanctions? So I think there is an appetite on both sides to return to the status quo ante. There's interest in Iran has in terms of getting sanctions removed. And certainly the United States would like to return to the international community in a way and show that it's a responsible actor in the international community, something that was transgressed during the Trump administration. But the politics are very, very tricky. The sequencing, the logistics, and the politics are very tricky. So I think the diplomatic piece, I think there are diplomatic pathways for getting there. The question is, how do you get the politics, how do you overcome some of the political constraints? And I think that's going to be something that I'm probably less optimistic can happen. And maybe Kayhan can add to that.
You mean from the US side, of course.
Well, I'm saying from both sides, probably, but yes, from the U.S. side, there's a lot of pressure on the one of the things the Biden administration is going to be focused on is trying to cement if they return to the JCPOA, that it be a much more a firmer foundation. Because if you remember, when the JCPOA was negotiated, it was never put forward in the Congress. It had tremendous opposition in the Congress, and it had opposition from our allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia. So I think there's going to be an attempt to try to bring Saudi Arabia and Israel not into the negotiations, but bring them into the internal discussions that are taking place in Washington, and bring in key members of Congress. That's going to put a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to probably take a slightly tougher stance than the Biden administration would like to take, because they're going to try to do two things: return to the deal, but also make it a stronger foundation so that a few years from now, if a Republican comes into office, the deal doesn't evaporate again. So it's a very, very tricky dance that they're going to have to play over the next several months.
Okay, Kayhan.
Well, I think
Political problems from the Iranian side.
yeah. I think the deal was a good and reasonable deal. As they say, it was a win-win for both sides. But the U.S. regional allies, as Ross mentioned, the Saudis and the Israeli Netanyahu regime, stole the deal. I'm afraid to say that they are starting to impact again on the Biden administration. If the Biden administration goes in that track, then again we see the situation further complicated. We should understand that the government, the moderate government of Hassan Rouhani in Iran, tried, and it is trying very hard to get back to deal as it was in 2015, at the top of it, lifting the sanctions, showing the promises that he gave to the Iranian people. But unfortunately, the Trump's policy damaged and imposed a lot of cost on the Iranian economic life right now that has, complicated the situation. The public opinion are against the U.S. will, aims, and strategies. There is this very strong distrust, not only at the government level, but also at the people level, because the people of Iran wanted honestly to interact with the U.S. to solve the problems. And they wanted to, to bring a better life by, further and increased economic interactions with the, world community. But the Trump administration took that from them. So the orientation of Iran's economy is changing now. It's going in different direction. There is no logic right now for Iran-Europe relations because the Trump administration has somehow deteriorated the relations between Iran and European countries, because European countries couldn't also deliver their promises. They have talked of, financial mechanism, but they couldn't because they were afraid of the economic revenge of the U.S. Perhaps they realized that they cannot get to that direction. That was another reason. So you see, Iran is now in a different situation. Right now, perhaps the government of Hassan Rouhani would like to go back, but it has been very costly, and there is other side of Iranian, community or power elites or power circle who do not trust to the US. That's why we have the question of who starts first. That is a strong debate inside Iran right now. And we have in daily basis that if we start or stopping, our steps, that is, returning to before, relieving those commitments, I mean, those steps that Iran took and the parliament, law, then we cannot trust the US to return to its promises. And if, time here, in my belief, is of essence. The Biden administration, if it wants to go in a smooth way, needs to show some kind of, confidence, and at the same time, good face, that could be tangible for the Iranians here. Otherwise, I think uh, there is less chance to go to further, talk. And the issue will become, when much complicated, that we connect the nuclear issue with the other, two main elements that the US believes could work on Iran. That is the regional issues and the missile issue. These threefold elements are against each other. They are contradicting each other. Even the Obama administration said that, okay, we got to the deal because we hope that we can reverse Iran's behavior in the regional affairs and limit its, missiles program. And this is the trap that the Biden administration again is going to that direction. Because as Raz mentioned, no country will negotiate on its deterrent power. And no country, and the deterrent power that is Iran's missiles, conventional missiles program, is related to Iran's regional activity. These two are interconnected. And if we have this problem, no regional talks or regional cooperation will be logical between the two sides. The Saudis will continue their efforts to impact on the Biden administration. The Israelis have their own agenda. No doubt that the Israelis' agenda is to limit Iran's, missiles program, which is going to kill any talk from the beginning. Then we have a complicated situation here. That's why I'm rather pessimistic, unless Biden administration, shows some good face and try to reverse this approach, which in my belief is completely wrong from the beginning. So that's my thought.
I just to pick up on what Kayhan mentioned, I think the other risk here is that of the spoilers. In other words, there are folks probably on the Iran side too, but certainly in Israel and in Riyadh, that want to scuttle any kind of rapprochement or any kind of movement back to the JCPOA, or the US rejoining the JCPOA. So I do worry. I don't worry so much about the UAE or Saudi Arabia, because I think they believe that that there's risk to them, that if there is a war between the United States and Iran, or Iran and Israel, that Abu Dhabi will probably be one of the first retaliatory targets. So I think they're probably not going to be quite as vociferous, perhaps, in their opposition. But I do worry about that the Israelis will take some action, either in Syria or even more directly against Iran, that could tie the hands of the Biden administration. And I do worry from the Iran side too, that there are those that don't necessarily believe that Iran should return to the limits imposed by the deal, as Kayhan mentioned earlier, and that there might be some issue that takes place, further issue takes place in Iraq, that again would tie the hands of the Biden administration, and tie the hands of the Rouhani administration. So I do worry about spoilers that don't necessarily see that they have an interest in a diplomatic solution here. And that is also a worry. And to Kayhan's point, that's why I think time is of the essence. The longer we go in this, the greater the likelihood that the spoilers will be able to take some action that undermines the efforts on both sides. The best efforts on the part of the Biden administration, and on the best efforts on the part of the Rouhani administration.
Kayhan, you keep mentioning the good faith that the Biden administration must show in order for the Iran to return to the deal. How would you describe this good faith?
Well, the hope is that, as it was mentioned by the supreme leader, who is the main decider of this dossier, is that, Iran condition or precondition is that the US must lift sanctions, as it was, the promise of the JCPOA in 2015, and it was part of the deal. So the good faith would be, lifting sanctions, or part of, to start, if we put it in a more, interactive way, to start a step-by-step approach, lifting, gradual sanctions, which I don't know if it was accepted by the Iranian officials, but anything that, could return Iran's distrust might help at the moment. And I think the Biden administration should also realize that there is a regional potential for Iran to feel insecure and being distrustful of the US aims and strategies in the region. For instance, this normalization of Israel with Arab countries has somehow shifted Israel from the center of geopolitical conflict to become a superior power to the Arab conservative regimes in the region. Iran is not afraid of Israel to be present in the Persian Gulf region for security reasons, but that will bring division, political division between Iran and Arab states. And if it goes in that direction, in my belief, and I'm afraid to say, that will lead to further, instability, the increasement of, extremism and other things. That's a new development. And I even think that the Biden administration should address these issues as well. I mean, the regional issues is part of that, new dynamic between Iran and the U.S. That is why Ross is mentioning that, there are a lot of spoiler actors, and there are a lot of spoiling issues between the two sides that can further complicate the situation. That is why I think the ball is in the court of the Biden administration to take some actions, because we cannot ignore the fact that the U.S. violated the deal, an international, recognized deal by several countries that has the UN resolution behind it, supported by it. Therefore, I think the Biden administration should understand that in what position Iran is, and at the same time, we should understand that Iran resisted very hard, and it was very hard for the Iranian people, for us academics, traveling, a lot of things that gives Iran, or at least the Iranian people, the reason to justify to not accepting any talk with the US right now. That's why I'm saying any kind of good faith, element at this level and stage would be very helpful to start, because the experience shows that Iran-US relations will better work in the process. If we put everything in the basket at the beginning, we kill, everything by the blame game at the beginning. We should go in the process and try to make, trust, and then go further. And the nuclear deal was the first step of making that trust, but it never led to the second or third level of making trust, that is regional talk and other things.
May I respond to Kayhan for 1 second or no?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I wanted to play on one issue that Kayhan mentioned. He referred to the Abraham Accords between Israel and the UAE, which is extending to Bahrain, to Sudan, Morocco, and ultimately maybe even Saudi Arabia. The motivation by the actors, Israel and the Arab countries, for the most part of the motivation was to build a bulwark against Iran, no question about it. I think one of the things that the Biden administration is going to need to do is to send a very strong signal to both Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and to Israel that this Abraham Accords should be viewed as a foundation, perhaps in the future, for broader forms of regional cooperation, and not as a cudgel, not as an instrument, not as a tip of the spear to be aimed towards Iran. Because if that's the case, if this alliance, this new axis that actually existed before the Abraham Accords, it's been building over the last 10 years. I like to tell my students that the Arabs were sleeping with the Israelis with the lights off. It's just now with the Abraham Accords, they're turning the lights on. That's been building. If that axis is going to be used for the way I believe the Netanyahu administration believes it should be used as a better instrument against Iran, then there's no hope for the region because it's only going to exacerbate regional tension. So I do think one of the best efforts the Biden administration should take, and they can do it privately, they don't have to do it publicly, is to send a very clear signal to Jerusalem and to Riyadh and to Abu Dhabi that the US is not going to be support, like the Trump administration was planning on doing, support using this accord as a foundation for building further hostility towards Iran. It will undermine US interests, it will further push Iran back into a defensive crouch, and it will only lead to further regional instability. So I think that is a good faith effort that can be taken privately, not even publicly.
Okay, Kayhan mentioned the process and that return to the nuclear deal can be just a first step in the process. How do you, Kayhan, imagine the process? Do you think that, and we have a question from the audience actually, from Eka, that points to the same direction. Like would at some point Iran be open to negotiation that extends the nuclear deal beyond the sunset clauses, some of which will expire in 2025? Can that be imagined as the next step in the process? And what would Iran expect US to do in exchange? Because if we're talking about the process, then there are steps that must be taken from both sides.
Well, you know, we see things in different ways. On the Iranian side, it's the nuclear issue as a priority to get to somewhere first and lifting sanctions. Then, as it was mentioned by the Iranian highest level, then we can think of other things. If it is not going to anywhere, we can never talk on other things. That means that we should separate these three elements of significance between Iran and the US. That is the nuclear issue, that is the regional issue, that is the missile program. They might be separated, but at the same time, they are interlinked in a way, in terms of making trust. That is why I am saying that the Iranians have this strategic distrust and feeling of insecurity from the US, because the US, you know, military bases are across Iran's border, perhaps more than 20, 25, 30, 35 if we count, not mentioning in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, and other places. These are, you know, threatful for Iran. The Iranians are thinking that the US has a different aims. Therefore, they are not going to negotiate on the two issues of regional matters and at the same time, you know, a missiles program, unless the nuclear issue is solved in the way that can be acceptable for both sides. By making in the process, I mean that we need to first to get to somewhere, then we make some trust and then go to other levels. But what is the US administration is doing and is hoping to do is to interlink all of them. And I think that the Biden administration is going to the same wrong, you know, direction by talking of regional issues and missiles issues at the beginning. And unfortunately, some European country at the top, France, is mentioning that because France is a country that always, when the Iranian and the US are going to possibly talk, would come to the scene to try to make its own point. I don't know, Ross can tell us better that what is the reason that France is always coming around by mentioning that, for instance, Saudi Arabia should come to the negotiations. What is the reason behind this? Unless France is trying to express itself, or the French president would like to play a role that makes the things more complicated. You know, we have a very complicated issue between Iran and the US that has been accumulated in the process of the time. And that distrust is not going to away overnight. And other countries are somehow bringing more complications to that. What is the reason for bringing Saudi Arabia in the negotiations? I do not see any reason for that. You know, if Saudi Arabia and Iran would like to talk, they can talk directly on the regional issues. What is that, the other countries come to the, the negotiations and try to make it more complicated? So I think, when I say in the process is that we first make, confidence building again, if we could return to 2015 and taking some of those points that the Obama administration in a very right way tried to do by a step-by-step approach. The Obama administration, realized that Iran is a regional power that cannot be ignored. And for managing Iran, it needs to approach to Iran. That was something very reasonable, situation for the Obama administration. But in 2021, right now, the situation has become further complicated because further elements came to the region. And at the same time, I think these two elements of Saudi Arabia and Israel are still active. And I think they are seeking the Trump administration approach in the Biden administration. And if the Biden administration goes in that direction, I am afraid to say that the situation will further be complicated.
I have a question from the audience, and it's Alex Batanka, also one of our professors, who has the questions to both of you. To Kayhan, Iran will arguably never become a normal member of the international community as long as its stated policy is to seek the destruction of another.
Excuse me, I couldn't, some noises in your voice.
Oh, I'm sorry. Iran will arguably never become a normal member of the international community as long as its stated policy is to seek the destruction of another UN state, which is Israel. What will Israel and the US need to do for Iran to accept that Israel is a fellow UN member and should be recognized as such? Can Islamic Republic ever agree to this? And the question to Ross: how can Washington convince Iran that Iran's Arab neighbors want the US to be part of multilateral talks? For whatever the reasons, the GCC states want US on their side in talks with Tehran. How can US convince Iran? How can US convince Iran that this is a reality and that is unlikely to change? So please.
Well, I'm afraid I'm surprised by this question. How could Iran will wipe Israel out of map? Israel is a nuclear state, and Iran, I think, will have some strategic constraints to go in that direction. That's the first point. Therefore, it goes to rhetoric and ideological issues to make some soft power and other issues. And to be honest, I think this threats of Iran is made by the Netanyahu regime in Israel to solidify its domestic politics, to show that it is himself that could tackle the Iran's threat. Someone in Iran said that Israel should be wiped off the map, but in reality, I don't think this is Iran's policy. And in actuality, I don't think this is going to happen. But on the other side, the questioner should ask himself that how about Israel's, nuclear weapons targeting Iran's nuclear facility? Isn't Iran has the right to be afraid of Israeli attack? I think so far as Israel possesses, these nuclear warhead, Iran feels insecure, and it goes to empower its deterrent power, because Iran's, compensation to an Israeli attack will be a massive retaliation by conventional missiles. And that is a balance of threat or balance of power between the two sides. Iran has tried to balance its power by a massive retaliation by conventional missiles. That is an international logic of a geopolitical rivalry between Iran and Israel. So I would put it in a kind of rhetorical issue that Iran is trying to eliminate Israel from the map. That is not the case. But the two sides feel threatened from each other, but at the same time realize that the situation between the two sides is based on balance of terror or balance of, threat somehow, which is working. I mean, any threat from Israel, know that will be responded severely by the Iranian military apparatus. Iran made it clear, and it is automatic. Those who are familiar with the military operation knows well that how this, works. Massive retaliation by missiles, conventional missiles, which can somehow balance the Israeli, nuclear strengths in a way. So we have the two sides threats perceptions. It's not one way, a street way of thinking that Iran is the only threat to Israel. Israel is also threat to Iran, and it is working behind the scene to, push on sanctions, dividing between Iran and its neighbors, acting against Iran's interest, cyber attacks, assassinating Iran's scientists, other things. That makes the Iranian public, to be honest, to think that the Israeli threat is going to be institutionalized in Iranian public. It wasn't like this, to be honest, a few years ago. But right now, with these actions, this is going to be different at the public level, not at the, government level. That was, of course, the threats always in their mind.
So first of all, Alex is a good friend of mine, so I'm happy to answer his question. Let me address one thing that was asked of Kayhan first. I think Kayhan makes some interesting points. I do think there are political sensitivities on both sides, in Washington and in Tehran, that each side should try to take care about. One is the Iranians are very concerned about talk that came out of John Bolton and others about regime change, right? And understandably so. I think on the American side, to be honest, I think the conversations that took place, former President Ahmadinejad, about elimination of the state of Israel or denying the Holocaust, and some of the pronouncements even more recently by the Supreme Leader are just not helpful. I think we can all understand the strategic considerations and the strategic concerns that Iran has about Israel for the reasons that Kayhan mentioned. But it's beyond that. It appears to be much more of an ideological hatred or ideological kind of conflict that is not helpful frankly, it's not helpful in Jerusalem. It's not helpful in Washington either. So I'm hoping that both sides can sort of reduce the temperature in terms of calming the discussions about regime change or other issues that are very, very sensitive in Iran. And I think the Biden administration will do that. And I think hopefully on the Iran side too, these issues around, the Zionist entity and delegitimizing the state of Israel, not just Israel's actions, I think would be important in terms of getting to a better spot too. So just to be fair, I think in terms of I think the question was, what can the US do to convince Iran to include other actors? I think, I don't think that including, if the question was this, Alex, do I think that the United States can convince Iran to bring Israel or bring Saudi Arabia, the UAE, into kind of a conversation on the nuclear deal? No, I don't. I think that this arrangement, the nuclear issue was conceived of as an international issue. That's why the original negotiations were with the P5 plus one, the permanent members of the Security Council, and plus Germany. And I think to make the nuclear issue, which is more of a global issue, a hot regional issue is not constructive. I do think that pushing eventually, once we get beyond the nuclear issue, towards some kind of a regional framework that includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, maybe down the road Israel, I don't know, and Iran and Turkey as well, some kind of a regional conversation on how to diffuse not just the US-Iran relationship, but diffuse the conflicts in the region. That's something that is a possibility. The Iranian perspective is that that should happen regionally, that the global community should not be a part of it. I'm not sure that's realistic. I think Russia, China, Europeans, the US probably can become play a positive role, at least use their convening power to bring the regional powers together. But I think on the nuclear issue, bringing Saudi Arabia and Israel into the mix is it's a non-starter. First of all, I don't think it's strategically sound. I don't think it's going to be helpful to the Biden administration, and it's certainly going to be a non-starter in Tehran.
Well, can I mention something? I think, Ross, you should understand that I think Iran is in favor of expansion of diplomacy with bringing Russia, China, Turkey, and other states to any regional setting. I think it's good for the region to do that. And what is Iran is trying to, pass from it is a direct, talk with the US on the regional issues or the Western Bloc on the regional issues, because Iran is afraid of losing on that. If we have an expansion of diplomacy, bringing Russia, China, India, Turkey, all of the regional countries, of course Iran will accept that, but not on the terms that the US wants. For instance, the US is saying that Iran's, for instance, these so-called, proxy forces should be eliminated or detached from the government of Iraq, trying to somehow diminish Iran's leverage of power and then negotiate with that. That is something that Iran is afraid of that. I think that's why I'm saying that it should go in the process, confidence building, even on the regional issues. We have different setting of Geneva talks for the Syrian crisis. We didn't get to anywhere because from the beginning, it was clear that the precondition of removing the Assad government from power was not possible because it wasn't in the process. It wasn't confidence building. I don't think that Iran is disagreeing with any expansion of diplomacy on the regional issues. In my belief, the regional issues, because Iran has this superior geopolitical leverage, is something that will be seen by the Iranian as a positive thing, no doubt. But the problem is that, the US is interlinking the regional issues in the broader context with the missile issue. The missile issue should be separated from the regional cooperation talks anyway, because it will kill the entire talks from the beginning. That's the experience that has been shown in the course of time. Well, I have no doubt that Iran would like to do that. Iran even invited Russia and China to do a sea maneuver in the Sea of Oman and Indian Ocean. It is not afraid of bringing other powers to the regional equation. But the experience shows that the US would like to force and impose its own terms on Iran's backyard interests. That's why Iran is separating its own negotiation with the Taliban in Afghanistan. It doesn't want to go in the US direction. That is wrong, because the US would like to go separately, not only about Iran, but about Turkey, Russia, other countries, China. Look what happened in the Trump administration in the US-China relations, in the US-Russia relations, even in the US-Turkey relations. Saudi Arabia is different because the Saudis are dependent on the US security guarantee, and that's a different story.
Right.
So that is not the problem. I think the regional talk could go, but in a fair situation, not on the US terms.
So Ross and then Kayhan, I'm very sorry, but we have a curfew in Tbilisi, so we have to end in just a couple of minutes. So maybe your final thoughts, and then we finish.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kayhan makes a fair point. I mean, I think if I read it correctly, Foreign Minister Zarif, when he was talking about a regional framework, did preclude the fact that international powers would be a part of it. But what you say makes sense, and that is if there is international involvement in some kind of a regional structure, a regional framework, it has to take the interests of all parties, not just Iran, but Iran included, but also the other actors in the region. So that makes sense. I think what is the only thing that I think I would like to leave on this note is that, listen, diplomacy is the art of the possible, I think, in some ways. If you're in this business long enough, you become very pessimistic. And usually if you're pessimistic, 90% of the time you're right, really, when it comes to the Middle East, and particularly when it comes to US-Iran relations. I hope that both sides can look beyond the pessimism and beyond the obstacles and see that there are common interests in not necessarily a strong US-Iran relationship, but at least a functional relationship that acknowledges the interests of both sides and the interests of the US and US allies, but also tries to address the regional issues of Iran. And I think if they do that, I think that it is a possibility to get to a better spot. Whether that takes place before the next Iranian elections or not, I think we should try not necessarily to be optimistic, but at least to be realistic that there are obstacles, but there's also opportunities going forward, and try to move beyond those obstacles to get to those opportunities. That's the only thing I would like to leave on.
Okay, I think much of the regional dynamics in the near future is dependent on the US-Iran's relations, no doubt, and the US allies' decision to how to go in that direction. But in the meantime, the US should understand that Iran has changed. Iran is more powerful now. It could escape from an economic collapse. It was very hard, but it is become, stabilized in its economy, and it has its political role. And the region also has changed. There are a lot of developments that has happened in the region, no doubt. And there are other elements of power who are interested in the regional issues, like the Russian elements right now, which is a new reality on the ground. So my conclusion is that the US should realize that we are dealing with new realities. It cannot, do politics with traditional approaches. Time has changed. I think geography, history, and cultural commonalities, the value of regional integration, a lot of dynamics are happening in the region. The different direction, transformation of young generation, a lot of things are happening. So the approach must be balanced in a way that could be compatible with the regional politics and realities and economic realities at the same time. If we go in that direction, I think that many issues will be solved automatically. So in my belief, the time will become of a great essence here. We need to take some time to find our real level of, equation in the regional politics. And it might take some years to go in that direction. But hopefully, with some fresh dynamic policy by the Biden administration, this could be accelerated to solve the regional problems. On the Iranian side, I think Iran is ready fully to somehow to go negotiation and solve the issues. It is against Iran's people and state interest to stay in the affair of instability and instability in the region or tension situation. It is not good for Iran because Iran is becoming a regional power, and a regional power needs to expand its economy and integrate its economy with regional, economy. And if there is tensions in the region, Iran would not be able to do that. So Iran is ready to go in that direction. Hopefully we go in that direction. I am positive of any talk with the US, but with different approach.
Okay, I have to thank you both for very interesting presentation and debates, and thanks to the audience. And let me just then express the wish that this nuclear agreement will be restarted, and the world will have one less issue to worry about. Thank you both.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Kayhan.
Goodbye. Goodbye, love. Yes. Good to see you. Goodbye.
Good to see you too.